What's up, guys? Sorry I couldn't be there in person again today to deliver the lecture, but hopefully this is a good medium in order for us to get some of the information and stay on track with the other IB classes, which of course is very important. So I wanted to take you through the Southern strategy of the British during the American Revolution today. We're going to talk about some of the major battles that took place in the South. And what we're going to be seeing overall is that the British are starting to tire out. They're losing most of their best men, and eventually this war of attrition that we're fighting against the British does pay off. So as I like to do, I want to kind of start off by taking a look at what we've discussed recently and just kind of rehash some of those elements. So when you look at this map, you can see overall how the British are playing out. The northern part is where we've seen all the fighting so far. We've seen, the fighting at Trenton, and of course starting with Lexington and Concord up here in Massachusetts, which was kind of the hotbed of fighting early on. We've also seen some of the fighting in Canada. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but most of the fighting has been right here around the middle colonies. So we're looking at New Jersey, New York, places like that. Today we're going to be covering the southern part. So we're looking at specifically South Carolina. A lot of the fighting took place there, and some action in Georgia and North Carolina as well. So to rehash again, the United States, or the American colonists, as I always should say, have already declared their independence, but of course they are not fully independent. They are still a country that is occupied, still a country that is at war with Britain. But this Declaration of Independence does change quite a bit because there's really no going back. And we've kind of hit a few points along the way where we've said there's no going back, but this time it is all together. We're saying we are in this, and we are declaring our full independence. So when they get together to sign that document, they're doing it because they have a belief that they really are going to win this war. In a lot of ways, the tide has turned because even though we've had defeat after defeat for Washington and his army in the North, we're starting to see some very major victories that are happening. Of course, the morale-boosting victory at Trenton, with Washington and his army, that made them believe. But then, of course, we have Saratoga, which is of enormous importance because it gets the French involved. And as we see, the French will arrive just in time, as Cornwallis will make his way back to Yorktown. But we also discussed a change in the not just morale, but also a change in how normal American citizenry are starting to see the war. Common sense, we talked about how common sense had started to be distributed, and over 150,000 copies exchanging hands. It's being read quickly, and then they're passing it along. So literally hundreds of thousands of people are reading this, and they're collectively coming to the same understanding that it is not just Parliament who has superseded their position by extra legal means, taxing them, as we discussed, but it's also the Crown, and the Crown, who this English Constitution has been allowed to exist, has allowed the Crown to operate. The whole system's corrupt, basically, is what one of the points that common sense is making. And so America in general, it's starting to turn. We're seeing some of those victories, but yet we're not quite there because the British still have a large number of soldiers located in the colonies, and we're going to see some of the worst fighting yet to come. So we'll go ahead and get started with the Southern Theater here, and you can see the years that the Southern Theater was active here for the British, 1778 to 1782. So, we've already been dealing with multiple years of battles, but the British really feel like they're going to be able to regain some ground here in the South. that it's going to be in the southern colonies that they'll find more support among loyalists, and that eventually they'll get enough support, they'll be able to pacify those colonies in the south and hopefully regain enough momentum to defeat Washington and his army. So after Saratoga, the British are going to be on the move, and they're really going to abandon those middle colonies, especially since Saratoga meant the addition of the French army and navy, which is on their way. That was the victory that we needed in order to get international support, and the British know that. So in late 1778, the British are going to capture Savannah, Georgia. And when they do that, they capture the entire Continental Army that's located at Charleston. So Charleston, South Carolina, and Camden following in 1780. So they're quite successful. They land at one of the lowest parts of the colonies in Savannah, Georgia, and they're working their way north from Georgia into South Carolina there at Charleston. And since they're gaining so much momentum, the Continental Army that's operating in the Carolinas at this time is being headed by General Nathaniel Greene. He begins a major war of attrition, and this is a concept that we've, of course, seen before. Washington kind of dancing around, but this is going to be the best example we have throughout the war. So Greene is going to start this war of attrition where he really is just kind of avoiding the British Army as much as possible. He's waiting for his opportunity to strike. He knows that if he goes up against the British Army just on his own at a time of their choosing, that most likely the Continental Army will be defeated. And he was right. So instead, we're going to see the Continental Army basically flee as often as they can until they find a good location to sit down and actually meet the British and to hopefully get a victory. One side effect of wars of attrition, which we see throughout history, one side effect is that for the British, keep in mind they're having to supply themselves over the Atlantic this entire time, and the biggest supply that they're in need of is simply men. This war of attrition is going to cost the British, even though they may lose more people, they may cause more casualties than what they're receiving. It's not as easy to fill those armies again. So every man that the British loses, it's going to take weeks for him to have a replacement. And so wars of attrition and avoidance that we see here are often very successful. But we see Nathaniel Greene go on the run. Ultimately, they'll come into contact with the British again at the Battle of Kings Mountain. And I kind of forgot to show you guys the map here. So you can see a little bit of what we're talking about. Charleston, of course, is a harbor city right there on the Atlantic. And here is Greene's army, Cornwallis's army. And you can see as they're kind of bouncing around, there's a lot of blue arrows. Greene is on the move, and Cornwallis is kind of chasing him constantly from behind. But the Battle of Kings Mountain is going to be where the British and the American Continental Army do ultimately meet. October 7th, 1780. Now, this isn't Cornwallis's full army yet. In fact, it's made up, we're seeing two rather large-scale militia groups pitted against each other. So really what you're seeing here are colonists versus colonists. You have patriot militias versus loyalist militias at the Battle of Kings Mountain. But it's a somewhat surprise attack, and the Patriot Army is successfully able to surround and defeat the American loyalists. Now, even though the Patriot Army does get a victory here, they do withdraw very quickly. Okay, they've kind of picked their battle, they've been successful, and now they know that if they stick around or try to advance, that Cornwallis will be waiting for them there. So even though the Patriots get a victory at the Battle of Kings Mountain, they withdraw pretty quickly. But overall, Battle of Kings Mountain, another victory for the Americans. the American patriots, I should say. But even more so, this is a great example of a surprise attack and attrition as a tool of war. So it becomes quickly one of the more important battles of the Southern Theater. So let's go ahead and talk about the Battle of Cowpens, which took place January 17th, 1781. The most important thing you need to know about this battle is that it was the turning point of the Southern campaign. So every war has a turning point, and when we kind of dig down and separate out the Northern campaign versus the Southern campaign, this is really what turns the tide against the British in the South. The results of this victory for the Americans is that twofold. First of all, the British will have to give up South Carolina. They're going to be the ones on the run after the Battle of Cowpens. So South Carolina is reclaimed from the British. But also one of the side effects that really comes into play later on is that the British lose a lot of their best and most experienced men at the Battle of Cowpens. A ton of British regulars are going to be killed in the fighting. And so you have not only the fact that Cowpens is a major strategic victory. I mean, it's kicked the British out of South Carolina entirely, but also a psychological victory because we are well aware the role that experience can play for soldiers, and the fact that the British, the seasoned soldiers that have been a part of this war for years now, many of them are killed at Cowpens. That is going to have a pretty dire effect for the British. The Americans at this point are going to pursue the British. They know they have the momentum with them, and the British realize that they are not going to be able to pacify the southern states. They are not able to rouse the loyalist support as they thought. And so the British are going to start heading back north. And we're making our way towards Yorktown. We're not quite there yet. We have one other stop to make. So the last major battle I want to talk about in the southern theater of combat is the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which took place March 15th, 1781. So Nathaniel Greene and the Continental Army have just defeated the British soldiers at Cowpens, and as I said, Cornwallis lost a lot of good, experienced men in that fighting. And Greene and Cornwallis are going to meet up once again here at Guilford Courthouse. Ultimately, the British do win this battle, but it is a Pyrrhic victory. And again, we talked about Pyrrhic victories a couple days ago, but it's spelled Pyrrhic. And a Pyrrhic victory is one in which you do get the win, you get the W, but you have had such devastating losses that it makes it very difficult for you to continue. And that's exactly the situation that Cornwallis faced. When he chased Nathaniel Greene into North Carolina, where the Battle of Guilford Courthouse takes place, Cornwallis emerges with his army so damaged that he realizes he has to spend some time recouping, and it's from the Battle of Guilford Courthouse that he decides to try and retreat to Yorktown, which is right alongside the Atlantic, to rest and refit for battle. Washington gets word that Cornwallis has kind of entered this retreating stage, and he knows this is the time to pounce. And so Washington is going to take full advantage of this, and in particular, geography. I always talk about how geography is key to understanding how history plays out, and this is one of those situations, because when we get to Yorktown, Cornwallis is going to find himself completely surrounded. He has Washington's army coming at him from the west, coming through Virginia, ultimately surrounding him. Cornwallis's back is to the Atlantic, and what do you know? But the French show up, and about time though. So we appreciate the help, but still, we get you back with World War I and II. Anyways, so the siege of Yorktown. This is I've kind of gone through and talked about it a little bit, but I need to do more detail. Cornwallis decides that Yorktown would be a great place to not only recoup, but also to try and reestablish contact with New York. You had, New York was obviously a center of importance for both sides. So in an attempt to try and regain some momentum there, and with Washington was still up in that area, Yorktown is going to be the place that hopefully they can kind of buck up and make a good show of it. But as I said, Washington and the French show up, and there are French troops on the ground too. Lafayette has been fighting. We haven't mentioned him as much as we probably should have, but you have a siege laid on Yorktown. So we're talking no one in, no one out. The American and French forces completely surround this town, and the British are completely outnumbered. Americans and the Americans and French forces number about 16,000 here. The British have about half of that. They're sitting at about 8,000 in Yorktown. But when they look out into the bay, they see a ton of French ships arriving, and they begin to lay siege. The siege of Yorktown begins on September 28th, and it takes a few weeks for Cornwallis to ultimately give up. The siege will last from September 28th to October 19th, 1781. And at that time, the British do surrender under Cornwallis, and 8,000 British troops lay down their arms. This is the last major battle of the American Revolution, but the decisions still have not been made on how to bring about peace settlement. So the peace deal is often just as important as some of these battles. So let's talk about what happened with the Peace of Paris. One thing that I try to remind you guys, we often think of history in 21st century dimensions, and it simply just wasn't the case, especially in regards to how they communicated. Remember, even though Cornwallis has been defeated at Yorktown, it still takes weeks for word of that to get back to Britain. And so this peace process is frankly not as easy as it may seem. Word had to be relayed back to Britain, and then it's not like they just can give up. They have to, of course, have a debate. And so you have on February 27th, 1782, they have the House of Commons voted against continuing this war. So they make the first step towards ending the war for the American colonies. A few days later, on March 5th, 1782, the House authorized the Crown to make peace with the American colonists. So, I think that's an interesting point. This thing started with complaints about Parliament, and the attention kind of shifted to the Crown as being the problem. But it's ultimately, power does lie in the English system with Parliament, and so they're the ones that agree it's time to give this fight up, and the Crown does begin to negotiate to bring about into the conflict. But again, it takes weeks. So we send negotiators over to Britain, specifically to Paris. That's how it gets its name, to try and negotiate some kind of settlement. The British could have continued this thing, and frankly, they may have been successful if they had. But after 5 years of war, they're tired of it. And, as I mentioned at the beginning of this unit too, even if they lose the American colonies, that's not it for the British. In fact, they will still continue to have the world's greatest empire for well over 100 years, really 150 more years on top of this. They'll turn a lot of their attention to their other colonies, what's happening in the West Indies, but more in particular, more so with India and Hong Kong. So anyways, them losing the American Revolution, the war, it's not the end of the British, but the peace process wasn't exactly set in stone. It had to be something that was ironed out, and then it had to be brought back and ratified by our government. So let's go ahead and talk about what the peace process decided, and ultimately it's going to set us up for our next war with Britain in the War of 1812. But let's talk about what happened with the Paris peace process. So the Peace of Paris signing takes place in September 3rd, 1783. Ultimately, if we're going to summarize this quickly, there are 5 major issues that are decided. The first and most important, of course, is that Britain does recognize the independence of what will become the United States. Okay, it recognizes the independence of the American colonies. And that's very important, even though they will often they will often take advantage of this, especially once Napoleon starts marching around and they attack our ships and whatnot. Officially, they recognized America as being free and independent from their authority. So that's a pretty big point. The second major issue dealt with boundaries, okay? Because remember, Great Britain still has quite a bit of land in America. So we're looking at pre-war boundaries over here on the left, and we're looking at post-war boundaries over here on the right. Excuse me. So even though we've defeated Great Britain here, they're still holding on to Canada, and that is going to be a source of tension over the next few decades that ultimately does lead to the War of 1812. But I'm getting off topic here. So the Peace of Paris first recognized U.S. independence. The second part of the peace agreement was that they did agree to the Mississippi River being the boundary to the western part. So you have Spain still controlling most of the western part of North America, or what will be the entirety of the United States, but the Mississippi River forms that natural geographic boundary between land owned by the United States and then land owned by Spain. Up here, as you can see here, there is going to be some dispute over who owns what territory. And in fact, the natural borders today don't exactly fall in line. This area that I'm pointing at is actually still parts of Canada today. So there will be some dispute over this, but the western boundary is formed by the Mississippi River there. The third major point is that the United States is granted fishing rights off of Newfoundland. So we're talking about in the water northeast of the United States, that the United States is able to fish in those areas, that their ships won't be attacked. The fourth issue to be solidified by the Peace of Paris is that merchants who are trying to collect pre-war debts, they'll still be able to do that. It was a major concern that they had been selling all these goods and had many of the colonists had accumulated a lot of debt. So those debts are not just forgiven. This agreement says that trade will begin again between the two nations, and that those debts still do remain. Now, debt is going to become another issue of the War of 1812, and I keep mentioning that because the War of 1812 is kind of the American Revolution Part 2. And we'll see a lot of these issues coming up again. The fifth and final issue is that Congress recommends that the states restore any property that had been confiscated by from the loyalists. Okay, so if when the American government, the colonial governments, if they confiscated loyalist property, this last part of the agreement, the American government agrees to give that property back to the loyalists. But many of them don't want to show their face again, so it remains in the hands of the Americans. But trying to try and bring about some end to this conflict. We don't want to persecute the loyalists too much, even though that obviously did happen. Well, after the peace agreement was signed, September 3rd, 1783, the war itself does come to an end. And the United States, as we now know it, has doubled in size. When you think about this war beginning as simply the 13 colonies, by the end of this war, we have double the amount of land that we did previously, and that's going to bring about tremendous opportunity, but also some change in American thinking, because we are and always have been looking westward. And in our next unit, we're going to talk about expanding west and desires to not only fill that land, but also begin to kind of inch over into Spanish-controlled territory. But with that being said, the American Revolution, or as the British call it, the American War of Independence, does come to an end with an American victory.